the harsh Treaty of Versailles. Ever wonder how a defeated country becomes tomorrow's supervillain? Look no further than the Treaty of Versailles, history's masterclass in how not to end a war. After World War I left Europe in ruins, the victorious Allies gathered in 1919 to dictate terms to Germany. France was particularly out for blood. They'd been invaded twice by Germany in 50 years and weren't feeling particularly forgiving. The resulting treaty wasn't just tough, it was deliberately humiliating. Germany was forced to accept full blame for starting the wars, the infamous war guilt clause, despite the conflict having far more complex origins. Their military was gutted to a token force of just 100,000 men. They lost 13% of their territory, including resource-rich regions crucial to their economy. And then came the financial hammer reparations initially set at 132 billion gold marks, a sum so astronomical that economists of the time predicted it would be impossible to pay. The German economy, already devastated by war, completely collapsed under this burden. By 1923, hyperinflation was so severe that workers collected wages in wheelbarrows, and the money would lose value by the time they reached the store. Children made play blocks from stacks of worthless currency. Families who had been middle class found themselves destitute overnight. This economic nightmare, combined with national humiliation, created perfect breeding grounds for extremism. Germans felt betrayed and desperate, exactly the conditions needed for a charismatic leader, promising to restore national pride. When Adolf Hitler began promising to tear up the hated treaty and make Germany great again, people listened. His Nazi party, once a fringe group, gained massive support precisely because they channeled the resentment created by Versailles. French Marshal Ferdinand Foch eerily predicted the disaster, saying of the treaty, "This is not peace, it is an armistice for 20 years. He was off by only a few months. World War II began almost exactly 20 years later. The lesson of Versailles echoes through history. True peace comes through reconciliation, not retribution. After World War II, the Allies learned this lesson, choosing to rebuild Germany and Japan rather than punish them. The result? Former enemies became stable democracies and close allies, proving that sometimes the path to lasting peace requires extending a hand instead of a fist. Thomas Migley Jr., the man who accidentally poisoned the planet. If you had to name history's most destructive individual, who would you pick? Hitler? Stalin? Surprisingly, a strong case could be made for a little-known chemist named Thomas Migley Jr., whose inventions harmed more humans and ecosystems than many wars combined. Working for General Motors. In the 1920s, Migley tackled the problem of engine knock, that annoying pinging sound in car engines that reduced power and efficiency. After experimenting with numerous additives, he discovered that tetrethyl lead eliminated the problem beautifully. GM was delighted with this profitable solution. There was just one tiny issue. Lead is catastrophically toxic to humans, but Migley wasn't worried. To demonstrate his product's safety at a press conference, he actually poured tetrethyl lead over his hands and inhaled its vapor for a full minute. "I'm not taking any chance whatever," he assured reporters as the poison absorbed through his skin. Privately, he later required months to recover from lead poisoning. For the next 6 decades, leaded gasoline pumped neurotoxins into the global atmosphere. Studies would eventually link this exposure to reduced IQ, developmental disorders, and increased violent crime rates across entire populations. Millions of children suffered permanent brain damage, all to prevent a little engine noise. But Migley wasn't done. His next project was finding a safer refrigerant to replace the toxic gases that occasionally killed people when refrigerators leaked. His solution, chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, marketed as Freon, seemed perfect: non-toxic, non-flammable, stable, and cheap to produce. Fast forward to the 1980s, when scientists discovered these same CFCs were destroying the Earth's protective ozone layer, increasing skin cancer rates worldwide. Every molecule of Midgley's creation could destroy 100,000 ozone molecules, and they persisted in the atmosphere for over a century. Historian J.R. McNeill once noted that Midgley had more impact on the atmosphere than any other single organism in Earth history. The final twist of irony? After contracting polio in 1940, Midgley invented a pulley system to help himself in and out of bed. In 1944, he became entangled in this device and died of strangulation. Midgley's legacy isn't just about unintended consequences, it's about how narrowly focused solutions can create far greater problems when we fail to consider their broader impacts. His story reminds us that innovation without foresight isn't progress, it's just changing the nature of our problems. The wrong turn that changed world history. History turns on the smallest hinges. Case in point, how a wrong turn by a confused driver ignited the deadliest conflict humanity had ever seen. The date was June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was visiting Sarajevo, a city simmering with anti-Austrian sentiment. His visit was provocatively scheduled on Serbia's National Day, which didn't exactly help the tense atmosphere. A Serbian nationalist group, called the Black Hand, had planned the Archduke's assassination. Their first attempt that morning went sideways, when a would-be assassin threw a bomb that bounced off Ferdinand's car and exploded behind it, injuring people in the following vehicle. After this scare, Ferdinand decided to change his plans to visit the injured at the hospital. Here's where fate stepped in. The Archduke's driver, Leopold Leuker, wasn't local. Nobody had told him about the route change. He turned onto Franz Joseph Street, exactly the route they were supposed to avoid. An officer in the car spotted the mistake and shouted at Leuker to back up. The car stalled while reversing, coming to a complete stop directly in front of Schiller's Delicatessen, where a dejected 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip had gone to grab a sandwich after the failed bombing attempt. Princip couldn't believe his eyes. His target had literally stopped 5 feet away. He stepped forward, pulled his pistol, and fired twice at point-blank range, killing both the Archduke and his wife Sophie. This accidental encounter set off history's most deadly chain reaction. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to protect its Slavic ally. Germany honored its alliance with Austria-Hungary and declared war on Russia, then on France. Britain joined when Germany invaded neutral Belgium. Just like that, a driver's confusion triggered a conflict that would kill 16 million people. World War I went on to collapse empires, redraw maps, and create the conditions for the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, and eventually World War II. The modern Middle East, the Soviet Union, America's rise as a superpower, all can be traced to the consequences of that wrong turn. History rarely announces its pivotal moments with fanfare. Often they arrive disguised as minor mishaps, their significance apparent only in retrospect. A confused chauffeur on an unfamiliar street may have shaped the 20th century more decisively than any general, president, or king. The Shah's fatal mistake. History is filled with terrible decisions, but few match the boneheaded move of Shah Muhammad II of the Khwarezm Empire, who managed to provoke the most devastating military campaign the world had ever seen. The year was 1218. Genghis Khan had already united the Mongol tribes and conquered northern China. Now he was looking toward the wealthy Khwarezmian Empire that controlled Central Asia and much of modern-day Iran. Despite his fearsome reputation, Genghis initially sought peaceful relations, sending a caravan of 450 merchants with valuable gifts and a message. I am master of the lands of the rising sun, while you rule those of the setting sun. Let us conclude a firm treaty of friendship and peace. Reasonable, right? The Shah didn't think so. Suspecting espionage, not entirely unfounded, he had the entire caravan massacred and seized their goods. Genghis, giving diplomacy one more chance, sent 3 ambassadors demanding an explanation and compensation. Here the Shah made his catastrophic error. Instead of smoothing things over, he had one ambassador beheaded and sent the other 2 back with their beards shaved off, a grievous insult in Mongol culture. For Genghis, diplomatic immunity was sacred. By violating this principle, the Shah had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Genghis reportedly retreated to a mountain for 3 days to pray, then emerged with a terrifying mission: the complete annihilation of the Khwarezmian Empire. The vengeance was methodical and absolute. Cities that surrendered immediately were spared. Those that resisted were destroyed so thoroughly that some locations remain uninhabited even today. Engineers diverted rivers to wash away any trace of rebellious cities. The Shah fled rather than face Genghis, eventually dying alone on a small Caspian Sea island. Historical accounts describe fields of human bones stretching for miles. The destruction was so extensive that the region's population didn't recover until the 20th century. Elaborate irrigation systems built over centuries were ruined, returning fertile farmland to desert. Centers of learning were burned, countless manuscripts lost forever. An estimated 40 million people died, roughly 10% of the world's population. The environmental impact was so significant that forests reclaimed abandoned farmland across such vast areas that global carbon dioxide levels measurably dropped, causing a temporary cooling of Earth's climate, the only time in history human activity accidentally combated global warming through mass death. The Shah's story stands as history's ultimate example of diplomatic malpractice. When dealing with a military genius commanding the most effective fighting force of the era, perhaps the one thing you shouldn't do is murder his representatives and insult his culture. Some mistakes can't be undone, especially when they awaken the wrath of history's most successful conqueror. U-110, the German sub that accidentally lost World War II. Sometimes the most consequential moments in history don't involve grand battles or inspirational speeches. They come down to someone forgetting to destroy their paperwork during an emergency. In May 1941, Britain was fighting for its survival. German U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced, threatening to starve the island nation into submission. The Germans coordinated their deadly submarine wolf packs using the Enigma encryption machine, and despite brilliant minds working around the clock on Bletchley Park, British codebreakers struggled to consistently crack the naval codes. Enter U-110, a German submarine patrolling the North Atlantic under the command of Fritz Julius Lemp. After attacking an Allied convoy, the sub was spotted and damaged by depth charges from British destroyers. With water pouring in and systems failing, Lemp ordered an emergency surface. As British ships closed in, Lemp shouted, "Abandon ship," assuming the submarine would be sunk by enemy gunfire. In the chaos of evacuation, the crew neglected their standing orders to destroy all secret materials before leaving. Here's where a split-second decision changed history. Rather than simply sinking the submarine, Sub-Lieutenant David Balmer from HMS Bulldog led a boarding party onto the abandoned U-boat, an incredibly dangerous move, as Germans often rigged their subs to explode if captured. Inside, Balmy's team found an intelligence officer's dream, an intact Enigma machine, current codebooks, settings charts, and the cipher keys for the entire month. They quickly gathered everything of value before the damaged submarine sank while being towed to Britain. The British kept the capture completely secret. They even staged a fake sinking of the U-boat to convince the Germans nothing had been compromised. The Germans obligingly held a memorial service for the crew, most of whom were actually in POW camps, and continued using their secure communications. With these materials, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park gained unprecedented access to German naval communications. Within months, the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic had turned. Allied convoys could be routed around wolf packs. Submarines could be hunted down with uncanny precision. The Germans, completely unaware of the security breach, couldn't figure out why their submarines were suddenly being located and sunk at alarming rates. They assumed it was new radar technology or improved sonar, never suspecting their supposedly unbreakable code had been compromised. Admiral Sir John Godfrey later called the capture an intelligence coup that transformed the war at sea. Historians estimate it shortened World War II by at least 2 years, saving millions of lives, all because a submarine crew forgot to destroy their codebooks while abandoning ship. History often hinges not on grand strategy, but on small human oversights in moments of crisis. U-110's capture reminds us that sometimes the most decisive battles are won not through firepower, but through a clipboard and some quick thinking. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's frozen blunder. When military historians talk about epic miscalculations, Operation Barbarossa tops every list, the textbook example of ambition fatally colliding with reality, geography, and winter coats. In June 1941, Nazi Germany launched the largest invasion in human history against the Soviet Union. Over 3 million German troops, supported by 600,000 vehicles and 3,000 tanks, surged across the Soviet border. Hitler was supremely confident, telling his generals, "We have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." The initial weeks seemed to confirm Hitler's arrogance. The Wehrmacht advanced hundreds of miles, capturing thousands of Soviet soldiers and destroying countless tanks and aircraft. German generals predicted victory within 8-10 weeks. Moscow appeared within reach. Then reality set in, specifically, the reality that Russia is unimaginably vast. As the Germans pushed deeper, their supply lines stretched dangerously. Vehicles broke down on primitive roads. The Soviets employed scorched earth tactics, destroying anything that might help the invaders. By October, the Germans faced a new enemy, mud. The Russians call it Rasputitsa, the season when dirt roads turn into impassable swamps. German tanks and trucks bogged down. The advance slowed to a crawl as Hitler continued demanding, "Forward to Moscow!" Then winter arrived, not the mild European winter the Germans knew, but the merciless Russian variety where temperatures plunged to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The Wehrmacht was catastrophically unprepared. Soldiers still wore summer uniforms. Tanks wouldn't start because their lubricating oil froze solid. Guns jammed. Frostbite caused more casualties than Soviet bullets. Meanwhile, Soviet troops were equipped with proper winter gear, skis, and weapons designed to function in Arctic conditions. Fresh Siberian divisions, transferred from the Far East and accustomed to fighting in extreme cold, slammed into the frozen German lines. For the first time in the war, the seemingly invincible Wehrmacht was forced into a major retreat. Hitler made things worse by forbidding tactical withdrawals. Units were ordered to hold positions until they were completely surrounded, resulting in massive casualties and equipment losses. By spring 1942, Germany had lost over 800,000 men casualties they could never replace. The failure of Operation Barbarossa marked the turning point of World War II. Germany never recovered from these losses, with approximately 80% of all German military casualties eventually occurring on the Eastern Front. The invasion that was supposed to last 10 weeks dragged on for almost 4 years, ending only with Hitler's suicide in a Berlin bunker as Soviet troops closed in. What makes this disaster so remarkable is its predictability. Napoleon had made exactly the same mistake 129 years earlier, losing his Grand Army to Russian winter. Hitler, convinced of his own genius, believed history's lessons didn't apply to him. His hubris cost millions of lives and guaranteed Nazi Germany's eventual defeat. The Nuclear Bear Incident. You've probably heard plenty of stories about how close we came to nuclear war during the Cold War. But did you know that one of the most dangerous moments involved a bear with epically bad timing? It was October 25th, 1962, smack in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the 13-day standoff that brought humanity closest to nuclear annihilation. Soviet missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, had been discovered by American reconnaissance. Both superpowers were on hair-trigger alert, with nuclear bombers in the air, missiles ready to launch, and military personnel operating under unprecedented tension. At Duluth Air Base in Minnesota, a security guard was making his rounds when he spotted something climbing the perimeter fence. In the darkness, he couldn't identify what it was, but given the crisis atmosphere, he assumed the worst: Soviet saboteurs infiltrating the base. Following protocol, he fired warning shots and hit the alarm. Here's where things went sideways. Due to a wiring error, the alarm triggered at Duluth didn't sound the normal intruder alert. Instead, it activated the nuclear war starting alarm at Duluth and several nearby bases, including Volk Field in Wisconsin. At Volk Field, the alarm meant only one thing: World War III had begun. Pilots scrambled to their nuclear-armed F-106A interceptors and started engines, ready to take off and execute their strike missions against Soviet targets. This wasn't a drill as far as they knew. Nuclear war had begun, and they were following their orders. The pilots were seconds away from taking off when a car came speeding down the runway, headlights flashing frantically. An officer had received word from Duluth that the alarm was false. The intruder wasn't Soviet special forces. It was just a black bear looking for food. The incident remained classified for decades. When finally revealed, it joined a disturbingly long list of nuclear near misses during the Cold War. Computer glitches, radar reflections from the moon, migrating geese, and training tapes accidentally inserted into real systems all brought us to the brink at various times. What saved us, repeatedly, were individuals who questioned automated systems, double-checked procedures, or simply hesitated long enough for clarification to arrive. People like the officer who drove onto that runway, risking his own life to prevent pilots from taking off toward Armageddon. The Nuclear Bear incident reveals something profound about our technological civilization. Complex systems can fail in unpredictable ways, especially when interconnected. A perimeter alarm incorrectly wired to a nuclear alert system nearly triggered the unthinkable, all because a hungry bear picked the wrong fence to climb during history's most dangerous standoff. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of human survival isn't our technology, but our occasional capacity to override it when it malfunctions. The slip of the tongue that collapsed the Berlin Wall. We've all had moments where we've misspoken in public. Maybe you called your teacher Mum in 3rd grade, or thanked the movie ticket seller by saying, "You too," after they said, "Enjoy your film." Embarrassing, sure, but probably didn't accidentally end a 40-year Cold War standoff or change world history. unlike poor Gunther Schabowski. By November 1989, the Berlin Wall had stood for 28 years as the most visible symbol of the Iron Curtain dividing East and West. East Germany was facing mounting pressure, both from citizens demanding freedom to travel and from neighboring countries already implementing reforms. Behind closed doors, East German officials had drafted a new travel policy that would ease restrictions but in a controlled, gradual way. The plan was to announce it the next day, allowing citizens to apply for visas that would be processed in an orderly fashion. Enter Gunther Schabowski, the East German government spokesman, who hadn't been directly involved in these discussions. Just before a live televised press conference on November 9th, someone handed him a note about the upcoming changes. With no time to review it thoroughly, Schabowski glanced at it and headed to the podium. During the press conference, an Italian journalist asked when the new travel regulations would take effect. Schabowski, shuffling through his papers, mumbled what would become the most consequential verbal fumble in modern history. "As far as I know, immediately, right away." Those words, broadcast live across East Germany, electrified a population that had been waiting decades for freedom. Within hours, thousands of East Berliners flooded to crossing points, demanding to be let through based on what they'd just heard from their government's own spokesman. Border guards, who had received no updated orders, were completely overwhelmed. They desperately called superiors who were equally confused. With crowds growing by the minute and no clear instructions, a commander at Bornholmer Street crossing made a fateful decision at 10:45 p.m. Open the barrier. Similar scenes played out at other checkpoints. By midnight, jubilant Germans from both sides were dancing atop the wall, taking sledgehammers to the concrete and celebrating a reunion many thought impossible just hours earlier. Television stations worldwide broadcast these images, which instantly became iconic symbols of freedom triumphing over oppression. The next morning, communist officials woke to find their carefully controlled state had effectively collapsed overnight because of a poorly prepared spokesman with an unreviewed note. Within a year, Germany was reunified. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union itself had dissolved. What makes Schabowski's blunder so remarkable is how it compressed what might have been years of gradual political change into a single evening of revolution. His accidental announcement didn't just open the Berlin Wall, it revealed the paper-thin authority of a system that could collapse from a few mistaken words on live television. The Maginot Line, history's most expensive detour sign. Have you ever spent months carefully child-proofing your home, only to watch your toddler find the one path you forgot to secure? That's essentially what happened to France with the Maginot Line, except instead of a broken vase, the consequence was national collapse. After World War I devastated France, killing nearly 1.4 million citizens and destroying vast regions, the French developed a single overriding national priority: prevent another German invasion at all costs. Their solution was the Maginot Line, named after Minister of War André Maginot. This wasn't just a basic border fortification. This was a $3 billion, in 1930s money, marvel of military engineering that stretched along France's border with Germany. The line featured interconnected underground bunkers with air conditioning, hospitals, and recreation facilities. Above ground, retractable artillery turrets could emerge, fire, and disappear again. Anti-tank obstacles, machine gun nests, and floodable zones created a defensive network that military experts considered impenetrable. French generals boasted that no force could break through this barrier. The massive construction project took a decade and was finally completed just in time for World War II. The French public felt secure behind their concrete and steel shield. There was just one glaring problem. The Maginot Line didn't extend along France's border with Belgium. Why this critical gap? It would have been too expensive to fortify the entire border. They didn't want to offend Belgium, which was neutral. Most importantly, French military experts considered the Ardennes forest along the Belgian border impassable for modern tanks due to its dense woods and hilly terrain. Hitler and his generals looked at this situation and saw the obvious solution. When Germany invaded in May 1940, they simply went around the Maginot Line, sending panzer divisions through the supposedly impassable Ardennes. The move was so predictable that German General Erich von Manstein had proposed it in 1940 as the perfect strategy, precisely because the French considered it impossible. The French High Command had been so fixated on their impressive fixed defenses that they had neglected to develop mobile forces that could respond to a flanking maneuver. Within 6 weeks, France had surrendered, and German soldiers were taking tourist photos in front of the Maginot Line's unused fortifications. The supreme irony? The Maginot Line actually worked perfectly. No German forces successfully penetrated its defenses. But in focusing so intensely on where the previous war had been fought, French planners failed to imagine how the next one might be different. Today, military strategists use the term Maginot Line mentality to describe any defensive style strategy that fails because it's too rigid and doesn't adapt to changing circumstances. It reminds us that sometimes our greatest vulnerability lies not where we expect an attack, but in the areas we've convinced ourselves are already secure. Mao's War on Sparrows. What happens when you declare war on nature without understanding how it works? Just ask China, which learned this lesson the hard way during history's most misguided pest control campaign. In 1958, Chinese leader Mao Zedong launched the Great Leap Forward, an ambitious plan to rapidly transform China from an agricultural society into an industrial powerhouse. As part of this effort, he identified the 4 pests that needed to be eliminated: rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows. Yes, those little brown birds became national enemies in what has to be history's strangest military campaign. Why target sparrows? Mao's reasoning seemed straightforward. Sparrows ate grain seeds, and China needed every grain to feed its people and export for industrial equipment. Chinese scientists estimated each sparrow consumed 4.5 kilograms of grain annually. With hundreds of millions of sparrows across China, that represented a significant loss of food production. The solution seemed obvious: eliminate the sparrows, save the grain. The entire Chinese population was mobilized for this bird war. Citizens banged pots and pans, beat drums, and waved flags to prevent sparrows from landing anywhere to rest. Children with slingshots formed teams to shoot birds from the sky. Workers climbed trees to destroy nests and break eggs. Government departments and factories competed to see who could kill the most birds, with prizes awarded to top performers. The most effective tactic was the exhaustion method. Whenever sparrows tried to land in trees or on buildings, people would create such a racket that the birds would take flight again. After hours of being denied rest, the sparrows would literally fall from the sky from exhaustion. Contemporary accounts describe sidewalks littered with dead birds after these campaigns. Within a year, sparrows were nearly extinct in China. Victory was declared. Grain production would surely soar now that these grain-stealing birds had been vanquished. Then reality struck. While sparrows did eat some grain, they spent most of their time eating insects specifically, locusts and other crop-destroying pests. Without sparrows to control these insects, their populations exploded. Locusts and other pests descended on farms in devastating swarms, devouring far more crops than the sparrows ever had. By April 1960, even Mao had to admit the campaign had been a mistake. He ordered sparrows to be replaced on the 4 pests list with bedbugs, but the ecological damage was done. This blunder, combined with other radical agricultural policies, contributed to the Great Chinese Famine of 1959 to 1961, which killed between 15 and 45 million people. The catastrophic sparrow campaign illustrates the danger of making sweeping environmental changes without understanding ecosystem complexity. It stands as a stark warning about human arrogance. When interfering with natural systems, every creature plays multiple roles in nature's web, and removing even a seemingly harmful species can trigger cascading effects impossible to predict or control. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, waking the giant. Talk about plans backfiring spectacularly. December 7, 1941 started as a stunning tactical victory for Japan and ended up sealing their eventual defeat. It's like celebrating after scoring a touchdown, only to realize you just kicked a hornet's nest in the end zone. Before Pearl Harbor, most Americans wanted nothing to do with the war raging in Europe and Asia. The memories of World War I were still fresh, and isolationism dominated American politics. President Roosevelt, who recognized the Nazi threat, couldn't convince the public or Congress to join the fight. Opinion polls showed overwhelming opposition to entering the war. Enter Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who planned the Pearl Harbor attack with brilliant precision but profound strategic miscalculation. The Japanese believed they needed to neutralize the U.S. Pacific Fleet to secure their conquests in Asia. Their plan was to deliver such a devastating blow that America would lose its will to fight and negotiate a peace favorable to Japan. The surprise attack that Sunday morning achieved near-perfect tactical success. In just 90 minutes, Japanese aircraft sank or damaged 18 American warships, destroyed 188 aircraft, and killed 2,403 Americans. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost just 29 planes and 5 midget submarines. But here's the fatal miscalculation. The attack transformed American public opinion overnight. A divided, reluctant nation suddenly united with a burning desire for revenge. As Admiral Yamamoto reportedly predicted, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." What's often forgotten is that Japan missed its most important targets. The American aircraft carriers were at sea during the attack. The vital oil storage facilities and repair shops at Pearl Harbor remained untouched. Within months, many of the destroyed battleships had been raised and repaired. The day after the attack, Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. The declaration of war passed with just one dissenting vote. Germany and Italy, honoring their alliance with Japan, declared war on America days later, handing Roosevelt the European war entry he had sought but couldn't achieve politically. The American industrial machine, now fully mobilized for war, would produce ships, planes, and weapons at a pace Japan couldn't possibly match. By 1945, the U.S. Navy had grown from 790 vessels to nearly 7,000. American factories were producing a ship per day and a plane every 5 minutes. Pearl Harbor stands as history's ultimate example of tactical success, leading to strategic disaster. In trying to break America's will to fight, Japan instead created the very conditions that guaranteed their defeat. Sometimes poking a sleeping bear is exactly the wrong move. Columbus's miscalculation. You know those people who refuse to admit they're lost and keep insisting they know exactly where they are? Christopher Columbus wasn't just one of them. He was their king. His stubborn geographical error literally changed the course of world history. By the late 15th century, educated Europeans knew perfectly well that the world was round. What they debated was its size. Most scholars correctly accepted the calculations of ancient Greek astronomer Eratosthenes, who had measured Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy back in 240 BCE. Columbus, however, chose to believe a minority view that drastically underestimated Earth's size. He calculated the distance from Europe to Asia at about 2,400 miles. The actual distance? Closer to 12,200 miles. Not exactly a minor rounding error. Based on this wildly optimistic math, Columbus pitched European monarchs on a westward route to the rich spice markets of Asia. Most rulers, including the Portuguese, rejected his proposal because their experts correctly pointed out he'd run out of supplies long before reaching Asia. But after years of persistent lobbying, Spain's monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella finally took a chance on him in 1492. When Columbus reached the Caribbean after sailing about 3,000 miles, he was absolutely convinced he'd reached the outer islands of Asia. He called the natives Indians because he thought he was near India. Even after 3 more voyages, he died in 1506, still insisting he'd reached Asia, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. The consequences of Columbus's mathematical error were world-changing. His voyages sparked the Spanish colonization of the Americas and the devastating Columbian Exchange, the massive transfer of plants, animals, culture, human populations, technology, and diseases between the hemispheres. For Native Americans, the results were catastrophic. European diseases like smallpox wiped out up to 90% of indigenous populations who had no immunity. Entire civilizations collapsed. Meanwhile, Spanish conquistadors, inspired by Columbus's discoveries, conquered the Aztec and Inca empires, stealing their gold and silver and reshaping the cultural and religious landscape of 2 continents. For Europe, Columbus's error fueled unprecedented wealth and power. American silver financed Spain's European wars. New World crops like potatoes, corn, and tomatoes revolutionized European diets and supported population growth. The colonial empires that followed Columbus reshaped global politics, economics, and culture for centuries. All this happened because one determined man refused to accept the mathematical consensus of his day. Columbus was catastrophically wrong, yet spectacularly consequential. His story reminds us that being wrong sometimes matters more than being right, especially when your mistake accidentally reveals something bigger than what you were looking for. The Trojan Horse Gift. Don't look a gift horse in the mouth might be good advice for most situations, but the Trojans really should have made an exception. Their failure to question one suspicious wooden present resulted in the fall of their mighty city and gave us history's most famous metaphor for deception. According to Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey, and Virgil's Aeneid, the Trojan War had dragged on for 10 grueling years. The Greeks, or Achaeans, had failed to breach Troy's impressive walls despite their best efforts. The city seemed impregnable, protected by massive fortifications that had withstood every assault. Finally, the cunning Greek leader, Odysseus, devised an ingenious strategy. The Greeks would pretend to sail away, appearing to abandon their campaign, but they would leave behind a massive wooden horse as a supposed offering to Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare. Hidden inside would be an elite force of Greek warriors. The Greek fleet withdrew to a hidden position behind nearby Tenedos Island, while the magnificent horse was left outside Troy's gates. The Trojans, celebrating what they thought was their victory, debated what to do with this strange gift. A Trojan priest named Laocoon famously warned, "I fear the Greeks even when they bring gifts," and urged them to destroy the horse. When a Greek spy named Sinon claimed the horse was an offering that would bring good fortune to whoever possessed it, the Trojans faced a pivotal decision. Despite Laocoon's warnings and his subsequent dramatic death by sea serpents, which should have been another clue, the Trojans made their fatal choice. They breached their own walls to drag the massive horse inside the city. That night, as the exhausted Trojans slept off their victory celebrations, Greek soldiers crept out of the horse, opened the city gates, and signaled their hidden fleet to return. What followed was the complete destruction of Troy. The Greeks slaughtered the men, enslaved the women and children, looted the city's treasures, and burned everything to the ground. A civilization that had stood for centuries was wiped out in a single night because they failed to look more carefully at an unexpected gift. While historians debate whether the Trojan War really happened as described in the epics, archaeological evidence confirms that Troy, located in modern-day Turkey, was indeed destroyed around 1180 BCE. Whether by wooden horse or some other stratagem, the city fell suddenly and violently. The Trojan horse tale has endured for 3 millennia as the ultimate cautionary story about deception and gullibility. In our digital age, it has taken on new relevance as Trojan horse malware uses the same principle of disguised threats. Perhaps the most important lesson is timeless. When your enemies suddenly start giving gifts, that's exactly when you should be most suspicious. The rejection of engineer Orban. Some job rejections change the course of personal careers. Others change the fate of entire civilizations. When Byzantine Emperor Constantine V turned down Hungarian engineer Urban, or Orban, he inadvertently sealed the doom of the 1,000-year Byzantine Empire. The year was 1452, and Constantinople, once the greatest city in Christendom, was a shadow of its former glory. The Byzantine Empire had shrunk to little more than the capital city itself, surrounded by the expanding Ottoman Turkish Empire under ambitious young Sultan Mehmed II, who dreamed of finally capturing the prize his predecessors had coveted for centuries. Into this tense situation walked Urban, a Hungarian artillery engineer who approached Emperor Constantine with revolutionary designs for massive cannons far larger than any previously built. These superweapons could, he claimed, bring down Constantinople's legendary walls, fortifications that had repelled attackers for over 1,000 years. Constantine wasn't uninterested. He recognized the value of such weapons. The problem was money. The once wealthy Byzantine treasury was nearly empty. Constantine couldn't afford Urban's salary demands, or the bronze needed to cast the enormous guns. After some half-hearted negotiations, the emperor dismissed Urban, hoping the city's massive walls would hold as they always had. Urban, rejected but undeterred, simply walked across the border to the Ottoman camp and made the same offer to Sultan Mehmed II. The Sultan, flush with resources and ambition, immediately hired him, asking, "Can you cast a cannon large enough to bring down the walls of Constantinople?" When Urban replied that he could make cannons powerful enough to bring down the walls of Babylon itself, Mehmed gave him everything he requested, twice the salary Constantine had refused, along with unlimited bronze, workforce, and facilities. The result was the largest cannon the world had ever seen, a 27-foot monster that could fire stone balls, weighing up to 1,200 pounds. Moving it to Constantinople required 60 oxen, and its crew of 700 men needed 3 hours to reload between shots. Along with several smaller, but still enormous cannons, Urban's creation gave Mehmed the siege power he needed. When the Ottoman assault began in April 1453, Constantinople's previously impenetrable walls began to crumble under the unprecedented bombardment. After a 57-day siege, the city fell on May 29, 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire after 1,123 years and changing the geopolitical landscape of Europe and the Middle East. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through Europe, accelerated the Renaissance as Greek scholars fled west with ancient manuscripts, and established the Ottoman Empire as a world power for centuries to come. All because one emperor couldn't find the funds to hire a talented engineer who then walked across the street to his arch-enemy. Sometimes the most fateful decisions aren't the big, dramatic ones. They're the mundane budget choices that seem insignificant at the time. Rome's trust in Arminius. Trust is essential in leadership, but misplaced trust can be catastrophic. Just ask Publius Quinctilius Varus, the Roman general whose fatal misjudgment of one man's loyalty changed the course of European history and set the boundary between the Latin and Germanic worlds that persists to this day. In 9 CE, Rome controlled most of Europe, including Gaul, modern France, and was pushing steadily eastward into Germania, modern Germany. Emperor Augustus had appointed Varus, an experienced administrator but mediocre general, to govern the newly conquered Germanic territories and prepare them for full provincial status. Varus knew little about Germanic culture or the challenging terrain of the region. Fortunately for Varus, or so he thought, he had a trusted advisor, a young Germanic nobleman named Arminius. Raised as a hostage in Rome and trained in Roman military tactics, Arminius had earned Roman citizenship and even been granted equestrian, knight, status for his loyal service. He commanded an auxiliary unit of Germanic warriors fighting for Rome and had Varus's complete confidence. What Varus didn't know was that Arminius was secretly uniting the Germanic tribes against Roman occupation. While smiling and advising the Roman general, he was organizing a massive rebellion behind the scenes. The perfect opportunity came when Varus decided to march 3 legions, about 20,000 soldiers, plus auxiliaries and civilians back to winter quarters near the Rhine. Arminius suggested a route through the Teutoburg forest and warned of a small local uprising that needed attention. Varus, trusting his advisor implicitly, followed this advice, leading his forces into a perfect ambush. The Roman column, stretched out for miles along narrow forest paths, was attacked from all sides by Germanic warriors who emerged from the trees. The terrain prevented the Romans from forming their usual battle formations. The ensuing massacre lasted 3 days. All 3 legions were annihilated. Varus committed suicide. The Romans lost between 15,000, 20,000 men, along with their military standards, sacred eagles, in one of the most devastating defeats in Roman history. When Emperor Augustus heard the news, he reportedly banged his head against the wall, crying, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." The consequences were enormous. Augustus abandoned plans to conquer Germania, establishing the Rhine River as Rome's permanent northeastern frontier. This border between Latin and Germanic influence would persist for 2,000 years, shaping language distribution, cultural development, and eventually national boundaries in modern Europe. Arminius, later known as Hermann in German, became a national hero and symbol of German resistance to foreign domination. 19th-century German nationalists erected a massive statue of him that still stands today. His betrayal of Rome, but loyalty to his people, raises complex questions about identity and allegiance that resonate through the centuries. The Varus disaster teaches us that sometimes the most devastating attacks come not from obvious enemies, but from those we've embraced as allies. True loyalty can rarely be purchased or forced. It must be earned through respect and mutual interest. Alexander the Great's lack of a clear heir. History loves its what-ifs, and few are more tantalizing than this. What if Alexander the Great had bothered to name a successor before dropping dead at age 32? One simple conversation could have preserved the largest empire the world had yet seen. By 323 BCE, Alexander had conquered an unprecedented swath of territory, stretching from Greece to Egypt to the edges of India. He'd overthrown the Persian Empire, founded dozens of cities, and changed the face of the ancient world. His next plans allegedly included conquering Arabia, North Africa, and possibly Rome itself. Then he attended a drinking party in Babylon and fell ill with a fever, possibly from malaria, typhoid, or poison, depending on which historian you ask. As he lay dying, his generals reportedly asked who should inherit his empire. Alexander's alleged final words, "To the strongest," might be history's most disastrous mic drop. Without clear instructions, his empire immediately became a power vacuum. Alexander's wife Roxana was pregnant with his child, but none of his ambitious generals were willing to wait and see if it was a boy. His half-brother Aridaeus was alive, but had intellectual disabilities that made him easy to manipulate. Alexander had no other siblings or adult children who could claim the throne. The result was the Wars of the Diadochi, successors, a series of conflicts that lasted over 40 years. Alexander's generals, once brothers in arms, became vicious rivals, each claiming to be the legitimate heir to different portions of the empire. Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Lysimachus, and Cassander all fought to carve out their own kingdoms. The human cost was staggering. Alexander's wife Roxana and his posthumously born son Alexander IV were eventually murdered. His mother Olympias was stoned to death. Most of his generals died violently. Countless soldiers and civilians perished in battles that raged from Macedonia to Mesopotamia. By 281 BCE, Alexander's once unified empire had fractured into three major kingdoms: the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Persia and Mesopotamia, and the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia and Greece. These Hellenistic kingdoms would dominate the eastern Mediterranean until Rome's rise, each preserving elements of Alexander's cultural legacy while engaging in constant rivalry. The fragmentation of Alexander's empire reshaped the ancient world's political landscape and perhaps prevented a unified Hellenistic superstate that might have stopped Rome's expansion, all because a conqueror who meticulously planned every military campaign never bothered to plan his succession. For someone who named over 20 cities after himself, Alexander showed surprisingly little interest in who would carry his legacy forward. His oversight reminds us that even history's greatest strategists can fail at the most fundamental task, preparing for their own absence. The Bay of Pigs invasion. Picture this. You're the newly elected President of the United States. Just 3 months into the job, you inherit a half-baked CIA plan to overthrow Fidel Castro using Cuban exiles. All your advisors assure you it's foolproof. What could possibly go wrong? If you're John F. Kennedy in 1961, the answer is absolutely everything. The Bay of Pigs invasion stands as one of America's most spectacular foreign policy disasters, a perfect storm of bad planning, worse execution, and catastrophic miscommunication that strengthened the very regime it was meant to topple. The plan originated under President Eisenhower in 1960. The CIA recruited and trained about 1,400 Cuban exiles in Guatemala, intending to use them as the spearhead of a popular uprising against Castro's new revolutionary government. Kennedy inherited this operation and, despite private reservations, approved a modified version in April 1961. Several critical changes doomed the mission from the start. The original landing site was moved from Trinidad, a city with escape routes to mountains, to the Bay of Pigs, a remote, swampy area. A planned second airstrike against Cuban air forces was cancelled to maintain plausible deniability. Most fatally, Kennedy refused to provide American air cover for the landing force. When Brigade 2506 landed on April 17, 1961, everything unraveled with stunning speed. Their element of surprise was already lost. Castro knew an invasion was coming thanks to local intelligence and press leaks. The coral reefs damaged landing craft. The swampy terrain bogged down equipment. Cuban forces responded with overwhelming numbers, backed by Soviet-supplied T-33 jets that quickly established air superiority. Within 72 hours, the invasion had completely collapsed. Of the 1,400 CIA-trained fighters, 114 were killed and 1,189 captured. Kennedy was forced to negotiate their eventual release by providing $53 million in food and medicine to Cuba, a public relations triumph for Castro. The political fallout was immense. The invasion exposed American covert operations to global criticism, undermined trust between Kennedy and his military advisors, and drove Castro firmly into the Soviet orbit. Most dangerously, it convinced Soviet Premier Khrushchev that Kennedy was inexperienced and could be pushed around, emboldening him to place nuclear missiles in Cuba the following year, triggering the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy later took full responsibility for the fiasco, famously observing, "Victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan." The disaster taught him valuable lessons about questioning expert consensus and military advice, lessons that would serve him well during the Cuban Missile Crisis when he resisted pressure for military action. The Bay of Pigs remains the textbook example of how groupthink, poor planning, and half measures can turn a dubious plan into an outright catastrophe. Sometimes the worst decision is trying to pursue an aggressive policy without fully committing to it. Chernobyl design flaw. In engineering, details matter. A single overlooked flaw in a complex system can lead to disaster. When that system is a nuclear reactor, the consequences can be catastrophic. The Chernobyl disaster of April 26, 1986, wasn't just an accident. It was the inevitable result of a fatal design flaw combined with a culture of secrecy and corner-cutting. The RBMK reactor at Chernobyl had a fundamental problem that Soviet nuclear engineers had known about for years. Under certain conditions, it became unstable at low power. Specifically, the reactor had a positive void coefficient, meaning that as power decreased and cooling water turned to steam, the nuclear reaction would paradoxically accelerate rather than slow down, the opposite of what you'd want for safety. Why would anyone design a reactor this way? The RBMK had advantages that appealed to Soviet planners. It could use lower-grade uranium and produce plutonium for nuclear weapons while generating electricity. The safety issues were considered manageable through proper operating procedures. After all, who would ever run a nuclear reactor outside its safe parameters? Enter the fateful safety test of April 1986. Ironically, the test was meant to improve safety by seeing if the reactor's turbines could provide enough residual power during an emergency shutdown to keep cooling pumps running until backup generators kicked in. Previous attempts had failed, and plant managers were under pressure to complete the test successfully. The test required reducing the reactor's power to about 25% of normal, but a series of operator errors caused power to drop to less than 1%, exactly the low-power regime where the reactor became dangerously unstable. When operators tried to raise power by removing control rods, they triggered a situation that exploited the design flaw perfectly. Within seconds, power surged to 100 times normal levels. The fuel rods fractured. Steam pressure blew the 1,000-ton reactor lid clean off. A second, Even more powerful explosion followed, spreading radioactive material high into the atmosphere. The resulting release of radiation was equivalent to 400 Hiroshima bombs. It contaminated vast areas of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. About 350,000 people were permanently evacuated. Thousands died from acute radiation sickness or cancer in subsequent years. The true death toll may never be known due to the difficulty of attributing specific cancers directly to the disaster. Beyond the immediate human tragedy, Chernobyl transformed public perception of nuclear power globally. It accelerated the Soviet Union's collapse by exposing the system's dysfunction and draining resources during cleanup efforts that cost an estimated 18 billion rubles. The disaster demonstrates how even known design flaws can persist when economic and political pressures override safety concerns. In complex systems with catastrophic failure modes, redundancy and inherent safety must take precedence over efficiency or convenience. Some lessons are too expensive to learn twice. Crassus's final campaign at Karhay. Money can buy you many things, but military glory isn't always one of them. Marcus Licinius Crassus learned this lesson the hard way in 53 BCE, when his quest for battlefield fame ended in one of Rome's most humiliating defeats and changed the balance of power in the ancient world for centuries. Crassus was already fabulously wealthy and politically powerful as part of Rome's first triumvirate, alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey, but something gnawed at him. Unlike his partners, he lacked military prestige. Caesar was conquering Gaul and earning triumph after triumph. Pompey had subdued the East and was known as Pompey the Great. Crassus, despite being perhaps the richest man in Rome, was mocked as merely a successful businessman and landlord. At age 62, when most Romans would be enjoying retirement, Crassus arranged to be appointed governor of Syria, specifically so he could launch an invasion of Parthia, roughly modern Iran. The Parthian Empire was Rome's major eastern rival, but there was no pressing reason for war. This was purely about Crassus's personal glory and his desire to match Caesar's conquests. Ignoring warnings and rejecting Parthian diplomatic overtures, Crassus invaded Mesopotamia in 53 BCE with 7 legions, about 35,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry. His son Publius, an experienced cavalry commander who had served with distinction under Caesar, accompanied him. The Parthians were ready. Their commander, the brilliant general Surena, lured the Romans deep into the desert near the town of Karha, modern Harran, Turkey. There, the Parthian force, consisting primarily of mounted archers and heavy cavalry known as cataphracts, revealed the fatal flaw in the Roman military system. Roman armies excelled at close-quarter infantry combat, but struggled against highly mobile enemies who refused direct engagement. The Parthian horse archers implemented what became known as the Parthian shot, galloping away from Roman formations while turning in their saddles to fire backwards. When Romans advanced, the Parthians retreated. When Romans formed defensive positions, the Parthians simply surrounded them and shot arrows into their dense formations. The result was slaughter. Young Publius died leading a desperate cavalry charge. Crassus, broken by his son's death and the disintegration of his army, agreed to parley with Surena, but was killed in unclear circumstances. The Romans lost approximately 20,000 dead and 10,000 captured, men who would spend the rest of their lives as slaves in distant Parthian provinces. To add insult to injury, the Romans also lost their precious legionary standards, the eagle-topped poles that embodied each legion's honor. These eagles would remain in Parthian hands for decades, a constant reminder of Rome's humiliation. Crassus's disaster at Karhay had far-reaching consequences. It established the Euphrates River as Rome's eastern boundary for centuries. It destroyed the political balance of the First Triumvirate, accelerating the rivalry between Caesar and Pompey that would lead to civil war. Most significantly, it exposed weaknesses in Roman military tactics that would require complete overhauls of their cavalry and archery capabilities. All because one wealthy man couldn't accept that buying glory is considerably harder than buying real estate. Hitler not prioritizing Britain after Dunkirk. Sometimes the greatest military errors aren't actions but inactions, moments when a decisive blow wasn't struck, allowing an enemy to recover and eventually prevail. Hitler's failure to focus on finishing Britain after the miracle evacuation at Dunkirk ranks among history's most consequential missed opportunities. By late May 1940, the German military machine seemed unstoppable. In just 6 weeks, Hitler's forces had conquered Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. The once mighty French army was collapsing. The British Expeditionary Force had been pushed to the Channel coast at Dunkirk, trapped against the sea. This was Britain's darkest hour. Over 338,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated from the beaches between May 26th and June 4th, but they left behind nearly all their heavy equipment, 2,472 guns, 20,000 motorcycles, and 65,000 other vehicles were abandoned. The British Army was saved, but practically disarmed. Britain stood alone, virtually defenseless. Its only fully equipped army division was in Egypt. The Royal Air Force had fewer than 800 fighters. The English Channel, for centuries Britain's protective moat, was now barely an obstacle to German tanks and troops gathered just 20 miles away on the French coast. Hitler had 3 options: launch an immediate cross-channel invasion while Britain was reeling, focus the Luftwaffe on destroying British air defenses and shipping, or turn east toward his ideological enemy, the Soviet Union. Incredibly, he hesitated on the first 2 options, and ultimately chose the third. Why didn't Hitler press his advantage against Britain? Several factors contributed to this fateful decision. He genuinely hoped the British would negotiate peace once France fell. He underestimated British resolve and overestimated the difficulty of a cross-channel invasion. Most fundamentally, he had always seen Russia, not Britain, as Germany's primary enemy and the source of living space for German expansion. Plus, the breathing space Hitler provided proved decisive. Britain used the summer of 1940 to reorganize its defenses, build aircraft, train pilots, and prepare for the expected invasion. When the Luftwaffe finally launched sustained attacks in August, the Battle of Britain, RAF Fighter Command was ready. By September, the Germans had lost the air battle, and Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion, indefinitely. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union, committing the bulk of German military might to a 2-front war he could not win. Britain, having survived its vulnerable period, became the launching pad for the Allied bombing campaign against Germany, and eventually, the D-Day invasion that opened the Western Front. Churchill later wrote, "In the history of war, I do not know any example of a greater error of strategy than Hitler's failure to concentrate upon the domination of the English Channel and the cutting of the Atlantic lifelines after the collapse of France." That error might have seemed small in the summer of 1940, but it grew to determine the outcome of the entire war. The window of opportunity sometimes closes faster than you expect, and once closed, may never open again. The Spanish armadas ignored weather warning. Never underestimate Mother Nature when planning world domination. King Philip II of Spain learned this lesson the hard way in 1588, when he launched his invincible armada against England, only to have it thoroughly wrecked by Atlantic storms. Religious tensions, commercial competition, and political rivalry had pushed Catholic Spain and Protestant England to the brink of war. When England's Queen Elizabeth executed the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, and English privateers continued raiding Spanish shipping, Philip decided enough was enough. He would invade England and restore Catholicism by force. The Spanish Armada consisted of 130 ships carrying 8,000 sailors and 18,000 soldiers. The plan seemed solid: sail up the English Channel, link up with Spanish forces in the Netherlands, and ferry them across to England. Given Spain's naval reputation, victory appeared certain. Several experienced Spanish admirals, including the expedition's commander, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, warned Philip about launching so late in the sailing season. The English Channel and North Atlantic were notorious for autumn storms. Medina Sidonia, who had never commanded a fleet and suffered from seasickness, actually begged to be relieved, predicting disaster. Philip ignored these warnings. The Armada sailed in May 1588, already behind schedule. After inconclusive battles with the more maneuverable English ships and a failed rendezvous with ground forces, the Spanish fleet anchored off Calais. English fireships forced them to cut anchors and lose formation. Then came the weather. Strong storms blew the ships northward into the North Sea. With no friendly ports available and contrary winds preventing a return through the Channel, the Armada had no choice but to sail home around Scotland and Ireland waters, notorious for their danger. The results were catastrophic. Atlantic gales smashed dozens of ships against unfamiliar coastlines. By the time the battered remnants limped home, only about half the original fleet remained. Thousands of sailors and soldiers had drowned, died from disease, or been killed by locals after being shipwrecked. Spain's naval dominance was broken. England's corresponding rise as a sea power would shape European history for centuries. The defeat gave tremendous prestige to Queen Elizabeth, who celebrated with her famous Tilbury speech. All because a king wouldn't listen to sailors who understood you don't challenge the Atlantic's fury in autumn. Even invincible armadas are no match for hurricane-force winds. The Tsunami Warning System Flaw, 2004. Technology only matters when it reaches those who need it. On December 26, 2004, the absence of a simple warning system transformed a natural disaster into history's deadliest tsunami, a tragedy made more heartbreaking because much of the devastation was entirely preventable. It began with an undersea earthquake off Sumatra, Indonesia. At 9.1 magnitude, it was the third largest earthquake ever recorded, releasing energy equivalent to 23,000 Hiroshima bombs. The seafloor displaced vertically by several meters, generating waves that would eventually strike 14 countries bordering the Indian Ocean. Here's the first critical mistake. Despite the earthquake being detected immediately by seismological stations worldwide, there was no tsunami warning system in the Indian Ocean. While the Pacific Ocean had sophisticated sensors and communication protocols established since 1949, the Indian Ocean had nothing comparable. The technology existed, it just hadn't been implemented. This wasn't from ignorance. Scientists and disaster experts had warned for years about the region's vulnerability, but funding such systems was never prioritized. The estimated cost of a basic warning system, about $30 million, seemed expensive until compared with the eventual economic damage exceeding $15 billion. The second failure was communication. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center in Hawaii recognized the tsunami threat within minutes, but had no established protocol for alerting Indian Ocean countries. Scientists frantically called embassies and government offices, but often reached no one who could take action. Many warnings went to offices closed for Christmas holidays. The consequences were devastating. Waves up to 100 feet high crashed into unprepared coastal communities. In some areas, water reached 2 miles inland. Nearly 230,000 people died across Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, Thailand, and other countries. Entire communities vanished. What makes this disaster particularly tragic is the time factor. While some Indonesian coastal areas were hit within 15 minutes, many affected regions had hours before the tsunami arrived. Thailand had over an hour. Sri Lanka and India had more than 2 hours. The African coast had 7 hours. With proper warnings, hundreds of thousands could have reached higher ground. The Indian Ocean tsunami warning system was finally established after the disaster, becoming operational in 2006. The system has already saved countless lives by warning of subsequent tsunamis. Sometimes our greatest technological failures aren't about what we can't do, but what we didn't bother to do until too late. The Library of Alexandria's destruction. Some disasters happen in dramatic moments. Others unfold across centuries, with devastating consequences that echo through millennia. The destruction of the Great Library of Alexandria, the ancient world's greatest collection of knowledge, represents humanity's most significant intellectual catastrophe. Founded in the 3rd century BCE under Egypt's Ptolemaic rulers, the Library of Alexandria aimed to collect all the world's knowledge under one roof. At its height, scholars estimate it housed between 40,000, 400,000 scrolls, staggering in an era when each book had to be copied by hand. The library wasn't merely a collection, it was the ancient world's premier research institution. Scholars from across the Mediterranean received stipends to study there. Euclid developed geometry in its halls. Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. Astronomers tracked celestial bodies, physicians advanced medical knowledge, and historians preserved accounts of vanished civilizations. What happened to this irreplaceable treasury of knowledge? Contrary to popular belief, the library didn't perish in a single catastrophic fire. Its destruction was more complicated a death by 1,000 cuts spanning centuries. The first significant damage likely occurred in 48 BCE, when Julius Caesar, besieged in Alexandria during civil war, set fire to enemy ships. The flames spread to warehouses containing books awaiting addition to the library. Later, in 272 CE, Roman Emperor Aurelian damaged the royal quarter containing the museum, the research institution connected to the library, while suppressing a rebellion. Christian antipathy toward pagan knowledge contributed to further losses in the late 4th century. The destruction of the Serapeum, a temple containing a daughter library, by Christian mobs in 391 CE is well documented. Finally, the Muslim conquest of Egypt in 642 CE may have eliminated remaining collections, though accounts of books heating bathwater are likely exaggerated. The tragedy isn't just what was destroyed, but what was lost forever. Works by Aristotle, Sophocles, Euripides, and countless others survive only in fragments or disappeared entirely. Of Sophocles' 123 plays, only 7 survive complete. Ancient histories, scientific treatises, and literary masterpieces vanished, leaving gaps that can never be filled. Or, most painfully, the library contained scientific knowledge that, had it survived, might have accelerated human progress by centuries. Early theories about heliocentric astronomy, advanced mathematics, and steam power existed in ancient times, but were lost and rediscovered over a millennium later. The library's destruction stands as history's most consequential intellectual catastrophe, a sobering reminder that civilization's achievements remain fragile unless actively preserved. Germany's D-Day decisions. Battles often turn on split-second choices. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, a series of German command failures transformed what might have been a devastating Allied defeat into the beginning of Nazi Germany's collapse in Western Europe. By 1944, Germany had built the Atlantic Wall, massive coastal fortifications designed to repel invasion. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had strengthened these defenses with millions of mines, beach obstacles, and concrete bunkers along the French coast. Despite these preparations, critical weaknesses in German command structure proved fatal. The first major error was strategic disagreement. Rommel believed the invasion must be defeated immediately on the beaches. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, preferred holding armored reserves inland for a major counterattack once Allied intentions became clear. Hitler, instead of choosing either approach, split the difference, the worst possible decision. Some panzer divisions were placed near potential landing sites, while others became reserves that could only move with Hitler's personal approval. The second error came from weather assessment. German meteorologists predicted conditions too poor for invasion in early June, leading many senior commanders to leave their posts. Rommel himself returned to Germany for his wife's birthday and to meet Hitler. When Allied forces landed, the German command structure was literally absent. The third and most decisive mistake was Hitler's sleep schedule. As reports of airborne landings arrived during the early hours of June 6th, German commanders couldn't get clear orders because Hitler was sleeping, and his staff refused to wake him. For critical hours, the few panzer divisions that could have reached the vulnerable beachheads remained idle. When Hitler finally woke around noon, he initially believed the Normandy landings were a diversion and that the main Allied attack would come at Calais. He withheld permission to deploy the strategic reserve until late afternoon, by which time Allied forces had established footholds and air superiority made daylight movement of German armor extremely dangerous. The consequences were enormous. Despite nearly 10,000 casualties, Allied forces secured all 5 invasion beaches. Within a week, they had landed over 326,000 troops, 50,000 vehicles, and 100,000 tons of supplies. The crucial foothold that would eventually allow the Allies to reach Germany had been established. Had German armored divisions been deployed immediately to the beaches as Rommel wanted, or had a unified counterattack launched before Allied forces consolidated, the invasion might have been repelled. Instead, rigid command structures, divided authority, and one man's morning nap helped ensure the largest amphibious invasion in history would succeed. Sometimes history's greatest battles aren't decided by who fights harder, but by who shows up. The Hindenburg's hydrogen choice. Behind every disaster lies a chain of decisions that, had any link been different, might have prevented tragedy. The Hindenburg explosion, that iconic image of a massive airship engulfed in flames, resulted from political choices made years before the airship ever took flight. The Hindenburg wasn't supposed to use hydrogen at all. Its original design called for helium, an inert, non-flammable gas that would have made the airship virtually incapable of the catastrophic fire that destroyed it. So why did the Germans use hydrogen instead? The answer involves politics, economics, and tragic timing. In the 1920s and 30s, the United States controlled nearly the entire world's supply of helium extracted from natural gas wells in Texas. Recognizing its strategic value, Congress passed the Helium Control Act of 1927, restricting exports of this crucial gas. When construction of the Hindenburg began in 1931, the German Zeppelin company still hoped to obtain American helium. The airship was even designed with helium in mind, requiring larger gas cells since helium provides less lift than hydrogen. But by the time the ship was completed in 1936, international relations had deteriorated significantly. The Nazi Party had taken power in Germany, increasing tensions with the United States. Despite negotiations and initial indications that helium might be sold for civilian purposes, the US ultimately refused to export the gas to Nazi Germany. American officials, particularly Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, feared the gas might be diverted to military use. Faced with a completed airship and no helium, the Germans had two choices: ground their flagship vessel or use readily available but highly flammable hydrogen. Under pressure to maintain their commercial airship service, they chose hydrogen, a decision that seemed reasonable given that German Zeppelins had safely completed thousands of hydrogen flights since 1900. To compensate, engineers implemented extensive safety measures, including specialized venting systems and strict rules against smoking. What they couldn't overcome was hydrogen's fundamental nature. When mixed with oxygen, it becomes extraordinarily explosive. When the Hindenburg caught fire while docking in New Jersey on May 6, 1937, the hydrogen-filled airship was consumed in just 34 seconds. Of the 97 people aboard, 35 died. Beyond the immediate casualties, the disaster destroyed public confidence in airship travel altogether. Within months, the era of passenger airships was over, replaced by airplanes. The tragedy of the Hindenburg isn't just that it crashed, but that its fate was sealed by political decisions made years before it ever took flight. Had international relations been different, had America shared its helium, we might still be crossing oceans in these giants of the sky. The Panama Canal de Lesseps debacle. Success can be dangerously intoxicating. Ferdinand de Lesseps, having completed the Suez Canal to worldwide acclaim, believed he could duplicate this triumph in Panama, a conviction that led to one of history's most catastrophic engineering failures, costing thousands of lives and nearly destroying France's economy. By the 1870s, de Lesseps was an international celebrity. His successful Suez Canal had shortened the journey from Europe to Asia by thousands of miles, transforming global shipping. Celebrated throughout France as a visionary, the 74-year-old engineer turned his attention to Central America in 1876. A canal across Panama would revolutionize shipping again. Ships would no longer need to make the dangerous 8,000-mile journey around South America. De Lesseps, buoyed by his Suez success, believed he could repeat his triumph. This was his fatal error. Suez had been dug through flat desert at sea level. Panama presented entirely different challenges: mountainous terrain, dense jungle, torrential rainfall, and deadly tropical diseases. Yet de Lesseps insisted on building another sea-level canal like Suez, rejecting advice that a lock system would be more practical given the terrain. The French effort began in 1881. Almost immediately, they encountered disaster. Landslides constantly filled excavated areas. The Chagres River flooded regularly, washing away equipment. Worst of all, yellow fever and malaria decimated the workforce. At peak construction, death rates exceeded 200 workers per month. In total, approximately 20,000 workers died during the French attempt. Despite mounting evidence that his sea-level canal was impractical, de Lesseps refused to change course. As expenses skyrocketed, the company resorted to misleading reports to keep investment flowing. By 1888, they had spent over $287 million, billions today, and completed only about a third of the necessary excavation. The financial collapse came in 1889. The Panama Canal Company went bankrupt, triggering a massive scandal in France. Thousands of middle-class investors lost their life savings. Several company officials, including de Lesseps' son Charles, were sentenced to prison for fraud and mismanagement. Ferdinand himself, by then elderly, avoided prison but died in disgrace in 1894. The canal lay abandoned until 1904, when the United States purchased the French assets for $40 million. American engineers wisely chose a lock system, and with improved understanding of mosquito-borne diseases, controlled the illnesses that devastated the French workforce. The canal finally opened in 1914, 33 years after de Lesseps began. The Panama debacle shows how past success can breed the arrogance that leads to future failure. Sometimes expertise in one area creates dangerous blindness to the unique challenges of another. Elisha Gray's failure to patent the telephone. First, history's pivotal moments often turn on tiny hinges. For Elisha Gray, a brilliant inventor who might have been remembered as the telephone's creator, that hinge was a matter of hours at the patent office on February 14, 1876. Gray was a respected electrical engineer and co-founder of Western Electric Manufacturing Company. By early 1876, he had developed a liquid transmitter capable of converting speech into electrical signals, essentially a working telephone. On February 14th, he drafted a patent caveat, a document announcing an invention he intended to patent, and sent his attorney to the U.S. Patent Office in Washington. And on that exact same day, Alexander Graham Bell's lawyer was also heading to the patent office with a telephone patent application describing a remarkably similar device. According to patent office records, Bell's application was recorded as the 5th entry of the day. Gray's caveat was recorded as the 39th. The margin was razor-thin, perhaps just hours, but it was enough to change history. When the patent office realized it had two claims for essentially the same invention, Bell's application received priority. Gray initially contested this, but ultimately decided not to pursue a lengthy legal battle, perhaps his second crucial mistake. The consequences were staggering. Bell's telephone patent became the most valuable patent ever issued. It launched what would become AT&T, a telecommunications giant that dominated American communications for a century. Bell became wealthy and world-famous, while Gray, though successful in other areas, remained relatively obscure. The story grows more controversial, with evidence suggesting Bell may have improperly gained knowledge of Gray's liquid transmitter design. Bell's original application didn't include this crucial component, but he added it to his device after filing, and it became essential to making the telephone practical. Bell's lab notebook from March 8, 1876, shows him testing a liquid transmitter remarkably similar to Gray's design. Further complicating matters, Bell's lawyer may have bribed patent office officials to gain access to Gray's caveat before it was officially processed. Patent examiner Zenas Fisk Wilbur later confessed, when in financial trouble, that he had shown Gray's caveat to Bell's lawyer in exchange for $100. Gray continued inventing and eventually held over 70 patents, including the musical telegraph and telautograph, an early fax machine. But the telephone, potentially his greatest achievement, slipped through his fingers. In the grand timeline of human communication, from smoke signals to smartphones, perhaps the most remarkable twist is how close we came to living in a world where children would learn that Elisha Gray, not Alexander Graham Bell, invented the telephone. Custer's fatal split at Little Bighorn. Military history offers few examples of overconfidence as fatal as Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's at the Little Bighorn in 1876. His decision to divide his forces against a numerically superior enemy resulted in one of the most stunning defeats in American military history. Custer had built his reputation as a daring cavalry officer during the Civil War, where aggressive tactics often yielded success. By 1876, he was considered a premier Indian fighter, though his actual record against Native Americans was more mixed than his reputation suggested. Flamboyant and publicity-seeking, he possessed supreme confidence in his abilities. These traits proved deadly when Custer's 7th Cavalry was tasked with locating a large gathering of Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho who had left their reservations. The campaign aimed to force all Native Americans onto reservations, opening the Black Hills for white settlement after gold was discovered on land promised to the Sioux by treaty. On June 25, 1876, Custer's scouts reported a massive Native American village along the Little Bighorn River. Rather than wait for reinforcements as ordered, Custer decided to attack immediately, fearing the village would scatter if he delayed. Here came his fatal error. Despite facing a force that significantly outnumbered his 600-man regiment, he divided his command into 3 separate battalions. Captain Frederick Benteen was sent with 3 companies to scout southward. Major Marcus Reno was ordered to attack the village from the south with 3 companies. Custer himself took 5 companies to attack from the north. This division violated the basic military principle of concentration of force. Each battalion was too weak to support itself and too distant to support the others. When Reno's attack met fierce resistance, his men were driven into defensive positions in timber and bluffs. Benteen, returning from his scouting mission, joined Reno's besieged force. Custer, meanwhile, moved north with his 5 companies, about 210 men, and encountered not fleeing non-combatants, but approximately 1,500, 2,000 warriors led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Completely surrounded and outnumbered, Custer and his entire detachment were killed in less than an hour. The battle temporarily energized Native American resistance, but ultimately accelerated the Army's campaign against the Plains tribes. Outraged by Custer's last stand, the government poured resources into subjugating the remaining free tribes. For Custer, a man obsessed with his place in history, the battle provided the fame he craved, but as a cautionary tale of hubris rather than the glorious victory he sought. The American response to the Tet Offensive. In warfare, perception often trumps reality. The 1968 Tet Offensive in Vietnam provides the perfect case study, a communist military defeat that became a strategic victory by shattering American public confidence in the war's progress. By late 1967, Americans were hearing that victory in Vietnam was approaching. General William Westmoreland, commander of U.S. forces, declared that the crossover point had been reached. Communist forces were losing more fighters than they could replace. President Johnson's administration pushed a narrative of progress, speaking of light at the end of the tunnel. This carefully constructed narrative collapsed in the early hours of January 31, 1968, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year holiday of Tet. In a stunning coordination, around 85,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces launched simultaneous assaults on more than 100 cities and towns throughout South Vietnam. The scale and coordination shocked American military leaders who had insisted the enemy lacked such capability. The most psychologically devastating attacks targeted symbolic locations. Viet Cong commandos blasted into the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon, and fought on the grounds for 6 hours. The ancient imperial capital of Hue was occupied for nearly a month, with communist forces massacring thousands of civilians identified as government supporters. From a purely military perspective, the Tet Offensive was a disaster for communist forces. They failed to spark the general uprising among South Vietnamese civilians they had hoped for. They lost an estimated 45,000 fighters, casualties they could ill afford. Nearly all territorial gains were reversed within weeks. The Viet Cong was so decimated that it never fully recovered as a fighting force. But on American television screens, the narrative was very different. For years, Americans had been told the enemy was nearly defeated. Suddenly, they saw communist forces attacking the U.S. Embassy, the symbol of American power. They watched ancient Hue in flames. Most devastatingly, they saw AP photographer Eddie Adams' Pulitzer Prize-winning image of a Saigon police chief executing a Viet Cong prisoner with a pistol shot to the head. The contrast between optimistic government assessments and the violent reality on television created a credibility gap that never closed. Trusted CBS anchor Walter Cronkite, after visiting Vietnam following Tet, famously concluded, "We are mired in stalemate." President Johnson reportedly remarked, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Public support for the war plummeted. 2 months after Tet, Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. The offensive directly contributed to American willingness to seek negotiation rather than victory, exactly what North Vietnamese strategists had hoped for. The battle that the communists lost on the ground, they won decisively on American television screens. Russia's Alaska sale. Some bargains look reasonable when made, but become legendary blunders in hindsight. When Russia sold Alaska to the United States in 1867 for $7.20 million, about 2 cents per acre, they had no way of knowing they were giving away what would become one of the world's richest territories. Russia had established settlements in Alaska beginning in the late 18th century, primarily for the fur trade. By the 1860s, however, their interest was waning. Fur-bearing animal populations had been depleted. The colony had never been profitable and was becoming increasingly expensive to maintain. Russia also faced pressing concerns closer to home. The Crimean War had revealed military weaknesses and strained finances. The empire was more focused on expanding in Central Asia and protecting interests in Eastern Europe than maintaining a remote American colony. Strategic considerations played a role too. Russian officials worried Britain might seize Alaska in a future conflict, potentially extending British North America, Canada, along the entire Pacific coast. Selling to Americans would keep the territory out of British hands, while generating immediate cash. From the American perspective, Secretary of State William Seward had long been interested in territorial expansion. Despite criticism, the purchase was mockingly called Seward's Folly and Seward's Icebox by opponents who saw Alaska as a worthless frozen wasteland. He negotiated the deal and pushed it through Congress. The treaty was signed on March 30th, 1867, transferring Alaska for $7.2 million in gold, equivalent to about $140 million today. The formal transfer ceremony took place in Sitka on October 18th, with the Russian flag lowered and the American flag raised. Neither side could have predicted what would follow. Just 30 years after the purchase, the Klondike Gold Rush began. Then in 1968, massive oil reserves were discovered in Prudhoe Bay. Alaska's resources eventually included vast deposits of gold, copper, coal, zinc, and timber, plus some of the world's richest fishing grounds. In modern terms, Alaska produces over $40 billion worth of goods and services annually. Its proven oil reserves alone are worth hundreds of billions. Beyond economics, Alaska provided strategic military positions throughout the Cold War and remains crucial for missile defense systems and Arctic operations. For Russia, the sale represents one of history's great missed opportunities, though had they kept Alaska, they might well have lost it during the Russian Revolution without compensation. Still, one can only imagine the geopolitical implications if Russia maintained territory just miles from the US mainland today. The Alaska purchase reminds us that land valued for what it is now may eventually be valued for what no one yet knows it contains, a lesson in the unpredictable nature of long-term investments. Decca Records rejecting the Beatles. The music industry is littered with bad calls, but none quite matches the day a Decca Records executive told Brian Epstein that guitar groups are on the way out after auditioning 4 lads from Liverpool. On New Year's Day, 1962, the Beatles drove 10 hours through a snowstorm from Liverpool to London for their crucial audition with Decca Records. The band John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and then drummer Pete Best performed 15 songs in just under an hour. They played a mix of covers and originals, nervous but hopeful this would be their big break. Decca's R&R, artists and repertoire, representative Mike Smith had seen the group perform in Liverpool and arranged the audition. But when decision time came, Decca's executive Dick Rowe wasn't impressed. Despite Brian Epstein's passionate advocacy for the group, Rowe rejected them, supposedly telling Epstein that guitar groups were falling out of fashion. Instead of signing the Beatles, Decca chose Brian Poole and the Tremolos, largely because they were London-based, making them more convenient to work with than the Liverpool group. The decision seemed reasonable at the time. The Tremolos went on to have several hits, but it soon became clear that Decca had made a catastrophic mistake. Within months, the Beatles signed with EMI's Parlophone label under producer George Martin. By 1964, they led the British invasion of America, appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show to an audience of 73 million viewers, and held the top 5 positions on the Billboard Hot 100 chart simultaneously, a feat never accomplished before or since. Over their career, the Beatles sold more than 600 million albums worldwide, revolutionized music production, transformed popular culture, and became the most commercially successful and critically acclaimed band in history. The publishing rights to their catalog alone sold for $47.5 million in 1985, about $122 million today. Dick Rowe partially redeemed himself by later signing the Rolling Stones after a tip from George Harrison, but the Beatles' rejection remained the music industry's most famous blunder. Decca's internal loss estimates run into the billions when considering album sales, merchandising, and publishing rights. The mistake teaches a timeless lesson about recognizing transformative talent and the dangers of making decisions based on current trends rather than timeless quality. Sometimes the next big thing doesn't fit neatly into existing categories. It creates entirely new ones. Blockbuster passing on Netflix. Great business disasters often happen not with a bang, but with a casual no thanks in a conference room. When Blockbuster CEO John Antioco dismissed Reed Hastings' proposal to buy Netflix for $50 million in 2000, he passed on what would become a defining company of the digital age. Netflix began in 1997 when Hastings, allegedly annoyed by a $40 late fee for a Blockbuster rental, Apollo 13, according to company law, envisioned a better rental model. His DVD by mail service with no late fees quickly gained traction, though it remained a small player compared to Blockbuster, which dominated video rental with 9,000 stores worldwide and $6 billion in revenue. In 2000, struggling Netflix was burning through cash and facing the dot-com crash. Hastings flew to Blockbuster's Dallas headquarters to propose a partnership. Netflix would handle Blockbuster's online presence, while Blockbuster would promote Netflix in stores. The asking price was $50 million. According to Netflix co-founder Mark Randolph, the Blockbuster executives laughed us out of the office. Antioco and his team couldn't see why anyone would wait days for DVDs by mail when they could drive to a Blockbuster store. The Blockbuster brass saw themselves as retailers, not technology companies, and believed their physical presence was their greatest asset rather than their greatest vulnerability. This rejection became a pivotal moment for Netflix. Rather than being absorbed, they redoubled efforts to beat Blockbuster at its own game. By 2002, Netflix had 857,000 subscribers. By 2005, it shipped 1 million DVDs daily. In 2007, Netflix introduced streaming, correctly anticipating that internet bandwidth would eventually support video. By 2010, they had 20 million subscribers. Meanwhile, Blockbuster's decline was dramatic. They attempted to counter Netflix with their own subscription service in 2004, far too late. After peaking at $5.9 billion in 2004, Blockbuster's revenue collapsed. The company filed for bankruptcy in 2010, and by 2014, all corporate-owned stores had closed. Today, Netflix is worth over $240 billion, with 247 million subscribers worldwide. The company transformed from a DVD rental service into a global entertainment powerhouse, producing its own content and revolutionizing how people consume media. Blockbuster's failure to acquire Netflix exemplifies how established companies often dismiss innovations that threaten their existing business model. Their executives couldn't imagine a world without video rental stores because reimagining their business meant acknowledging their vulnerability. The Suez Crisis miscalculation. Empires don't usually collapse over a single canal, but in 1956, Britain and France's disastrous Suez intervention accelerated their decline from global powers to second-tier players virtually overnight. The trouble began when Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in July 1956. The canal, which connects the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, was operated by a British-French company and considered vital to European oil supplies and colonial connections. Nasser seized it partly in response to Western nations withdrawing funding for the Aswan High Dam project after Egypt recognized Communist China. Britain and France were furious. British Prime Minister Anthony Eden, in particular, viewed Nasser as another Hitler who had to be stopped. They secretly conspired with Israel on an elaborate plan. Israel would invade Egypt, and Britain and France would intervene as peacekeepers to protect the canal, conveniently retaking control in the process. The invasion began on October 29th, when Israeli forces entered the Sinai. Britain and France issued their planned ultimatum, and when Egypt predictably refused, they began bombing Egyptian airfield on October 31st. Paratroopers and ground forces followed on November 5th. Militarily, the operation succeeded. Egyptian forces were quickly defeated, but politically, it became a catastrophe. The conspirators had made a fundamental miscalculation. They failed to consult or even inform the United States, their crucial Cold War ally. President Eisenhower was livid. The U.S. had been deliberately kept in the dark about the invasion plans. With a presidential election just days away, and the Soviets threatening to intervene on Egypt's behalf, Eisenhower faced a potential nuclear confrontation because of Allies' colonial adventurism. The U.S. response was swift and severe. Eisenhower refused to support the pound sterling as it collapsed under financial pressure. He pushed for a UN resolution condemning the invasion. He threatened to cut off oil supplies to Western Europe unless British and French forces withdrew. Faced with economic collapse, international isolation, and American fury, Britain and France surrendered to reality. By December 22nd, they had withdrawn all forces, accomplishing nothing except humiliation. The consequences were profound. Eden resigned in disgrace. Britain and France's standing as independent global powers was shattered. The crisis accelerated decolonization, as remaining colonies saw that their rulers no longer had the power or will to maintain empire. Most significantly, it demonstrated that neither country could act militarily without American approval, a reality that continues today.